So let's talk about the real cost of Warhammer 40k armies, with a look at a whole bunch of competitive armies and how much they cost you in the real world. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k armies and a few thoughts as to how much it might cost to put a competitive army list on the table from a standing start. It's often quite a common talking point that Warhammer 40k is a pretty expensive hobby in terms of the price for the model kit. Games Workshop tend to charge a fair bit more than most of their competitors, and everyone knows that it varies massively from army to army. Some more elite things, often in power armor, tend to be slightly better deals than most, where some armies might set you back really quite a lot more, like say Abmech. For this video I thought it could just be fun to look at a cross-section of Warhammer 40k lists, this time taking a look at a bunch of tournament lists from a recent video that I did, roughly how much they'd cost if bought directly from Games Workshop, which I guess is usually the most that you'd hope to pay for them, and there's plenty of ways that you can save a bit of money, as I'll talk about a bit at the end of the video. It was interesting to take a look at one of the armies and see a few of the ways that you could theoretically reduce the cost of it if you went via discounts via a few different avenues. Obviously these army lists are just going to be one example of what you could do with their factions. Some armies might vary really quite greatly one way or the other in terms of price. Definitely ways that you could collect each faction a bit cheaper by selecting certain kits, and all armies have things that are pretty much worse value for this if you'd focused on them. As ever when talking through Warhammer 40k value things, if you did want to save a bit of money on new shiny plastic models, there's plenty of discount retailers links down in the video description around the world. Can be a way to save a bit versus Games Workshop's top line prices, and anything bought through clicking those does help to support the channel as well, so a big thank you to those doing that when they pick up new stuff. Let's jump into some top performing army lists though, and how much they'd cost. First up we have the Space Marine Gladius list by Pontus Koch, who used it to win a Pariah Nexus tournament. It's an Ultramarines Gladius led by Manius Calgar and Uriel Ventris, a good mix of different infantry flavours, with some scary Hellblasters with the Fire Discipline combo, a bunch of Jump Intercessors, and a couple of Gladiator Lancers and a Land Raider Redeemer to deliver some scary assault into close combat. Looking at the price for this one, it should set you back around about $1,022 US, which is maybe a little bit more than I'd expected for a Space Marine list. Going through the prices on the web store, that would be £643 or 820 euros. As we know, Games Workshop famously doesn't have a direct currency comparison, so it will be quite a lot cheaper in real terms to purchase in the UK, particularly versus the USA, where they mark things up quite a lot, never mind places like Australia and New Zealand. For this army list, there weren't really any good Space Marine discount bundles that fit neatly into the unit selectors. The Blood Angels Combat Patrol wouldn't have been far off, but you would have needed to leave behind the Librarian, the Aggressors, and you kind of annoyingly only have 5 of the 10 Phobos Marines that you needed, so decided to leave it out. And the price does include a full Scout Squad kit as well, so you'll be left with 5 more Scouts left over from this. In recent times, Space Marines aren't quite as good value as they used to be, at least for their more standard offerings. Quite a lot of their elite unit things don't really tend to be amazing points per dollar, though you do get some good ones, such as the Hellblasters, where you get an entire squad of 10 fairly elite infantry for a bit over $60, and Calgar isn't too bad in himself in terms of money for the points as well. In this army, the worst thing in terms of points per the money was the Impulsor, I believe. I've always thought that was kind of fantastically expensive as the standard Space Marine transport, particularly given it's basically a hover rhino that only costs 80 points in game. Next up, we've got a list for one of the most expensive armies in 40k, this one the Adeptus Mechanicus. This one a list that went 4-1 at Darksphere GT, run by Samuel Martin, and it's a Skitarii Hunter cohort list that's still fairly Horde style Admech as they go. Almost 100 models on the field. As you'd expect with recent Admech, there's loads of battle line with Rangers and Vanguard, plenty of Ross Stalkers with 3 units of them, a few transports with Dune Riders to move them around, and a couple of big squads of Ironstrider Ballistari, models that always feel painfully pricey for the Admech, given that you often want to run them in multiples as here, but they come in individual model kits and not cheap ones either. As you might expect, the Admech cost is kind of astronomical, $1,502 or around £920 or around 1,200 euros. They are well known for being one of the most expensive factions that you can collect in Warhammer 40k, and the recent update, while it did up their points a little bit, didn't really change them from being an expensive army into a cheap one or anything. This was one of the army lists I was able to use some combat patrols for discounts. I used 2 copies of the Admech Combat Patrol to save money in this, though it does leave us with 2 unused Tech Priests. You'd have a couple of Manipuluses left over after this. Even with a few new units getting points bumps, there's plenty of things that are at or below 1 point per dollar, things like the Cerberus Raiders here. and most of the rest of the army is at that kind of level as well. If not 1 point per dollar, then only just above it. Things like the Tabaxi, Iron Striders, and Rust Stalkers are all pretty close to that sort of level. For the Admech in terms of points per money, Core's the best out of this list. In general, the Castellan robots tend to do quite well, but haven't really been particularly competitive for a while at this point. Next up, we've got an Orky army list with a War Horde run by Randy Brigham, who uses to take third at the Battle for the Capital. This one's Squig Hogs and War Bosses and Trucks in a War Horde. 12 Squig Hog boys in total, including the Knobs plus a Beast Boss, 3 War Bosses leading some Knobs and boys in trucks, a few Flash Kits, and some Gretchen and Storm boys to score things. Adding up this one, it comes to just over $1,000, equating to around about £640 or €789. In general, as it goes, this one feels like it's not the worst Orc list out there in terms of money spent. The Squig Hog boys and the Knob squads both give you at least fairly reasonable ratios in terms of points on the board for how much you spend. I certainly feel like there's plenty more in the Codex that will put you up much higher than that. The trucks aren't particularly great on that front, but things like mech guns or buggies, if you went down the standard Games Workshop route, they could set you back really quite a lot. For the Chaos Marines, we've got this list by Samuel Smith, an interesting and fairly accursed cultist-focused Chaos Space Marine army, 2 dark communes leading 2 big blocks of 16 accursed cultists, some Raptors, Bikers, and Legionaries and a Rhino to support for objective type things, a few big guns with some Predator Destructors, a Vindicator, and a random allied War Dog Carnival. Looks like this one comes to $988 if bought through Games Workshop, around about £600 or €770. Maybe that number's being a little bit harsh to this one, given that I included the cost of the box of 2 War Dogs, so you would have an entire extra vehicle left over from this list. For the most part, I feel like Chaos Space Marines don't tend to be enormously spendy in terms of Warhammer 40k. Not one of the cheapest armies in the game, but big fairly elite models can help. Out of this army, the Legionaries come in as one of the best points per dollar at around about 2.6. The standard cultists are some of the worst. Games Workshop Horde troops that are really cheap to field in game often tend to. Some other Chaos choices could have been significantly better value, if say there was an Abaddon or some Chaos Terminators on the table. They're both not too bad for getting points on the board for the money spent. Next up, to look at a pretty different army, we've got an Imperial Knights list, this one by Michael Roberts, and using Canis Rex, a Knight Crusader, a Knight Lancer, one of the big tall ones from Forge World, 4 Armiger Helverins, so the ranged Armiger, and an allied Inquisitor. Knights tend to just be a few really big models. For the Knights part, this one's come in at lower than the majority of the others seen so far, $794, just under £500 or 630-ish euros. For the Inquisitor in the calculation, I used Eisenhorn as a stand-in counts as. Imperial Knights don't really have the very best points per dollar sort of ratios in all of Warhammer 40k, but pretty much none of their models are outright bad for it either. They usually tend to be somewhere between 2 to 3-ish. Armigers and War Dogs tend to be a little bit better than the big Knights for that ratio. Maybe not too surprising that Imperial Knights have a reputation for being a bit cheaper to jump into Warhammer 40k than some. I think more so than just literally the actual price ratio. It's more the fact that there's only so many versions of Knight that you can collect here, a couple of Questoris Knights fully magnetised to be able to field any variant, plus a few Armigers magnetised for Warglaive plus Helverin, and you can already field a massive amount of variety of Knight army lists out there, as they just don't have that many kits that represent their units. Next up, we've got some Necrons, and this was a Hypercrypt army list run by someone called David Necron and Dukas. Really quite a balanced example of a Necron army at the moment. There's Imitate the Stormlord, a Locust Lord, and an Overlord with Translocation Shroud heading everything up, a couple of Cryptex, and then there's a good balance of some Immortals, Wraiths, Deathmarks, Locust Destroyers, a big block of Lichguard, a Nightbringer Catan, and a Monolith to back them all up. Lots of teleporting Necron goodness there. For this one, this turns out to be fairly similar to the Space Marine Orcs and Chaos, just a tiny bit cheaper than any of those, $975, translating to £536 or 784 euros. For this one I did make a few approximations though. There's no current miniature for the Locust Lord, so I used a heavy destroyer cost and assumed that you kit bash from that. I used a Hyrotech Circle to represent the Technomancer plus an Immortal squad, a fairly handy little mini discount saving there. And for the Plasmancer, usually he's only available in a big kit that has the Scorpet Lord and Canoptek Reanimator and a bunch of things as well. It didn't seem very representative to be paying for a big multi-kit if you literally just wanted the one model, so I counted him as a Chronomancer. Maybe pick one up second hand, convert one, or just use a model as stand-in. All that being said though, looks like the Necron list is fairly standard in terms of pricing versus the rest of them. Out of cheaper and not so cheap models, the Catan Shard of the Nightbringer easily gets you the most points on the board for the cost, though it is really quite an old resin miniature. I've got no doubt that Games Workshop will be redoing it in style at some point. Finally, I thought we'd take a look at an army that's fairly well renowned for being one of the cheapest 40k armies that you can play. Adeptus Custodes might occasionally win the very cheapest, particularly with their new Combat Patrol box set, though Grey Knights are pretty close, and I thought I'd take a look at them. This was a list by Ruben Zhao. He used a list with 3 Dread Knights, 3 Brotherhood Librarians, 2 Terminator squads, and a bunch of power armoured infantry, plus an Eversaw assassin. This one did happen to fit in really well with the Grey Knight Combat Patrol, which gets you a Librarian, Dread Knight, a power armoured squad, and some Terminators. So you could basically get 2 copies of that, and then just 1 extra Dread Knight, Brotherhood Librarian, and a 10-man strike squad, and that's all the list bar the Assassin accounted for. As a result, it's come to by far the cheapest out of the armies looked at for this one, $553 US, £336 or 432 euros, roughly half the cost for this particular list versus things like the Space Marines, Orks, Necrons and Chaos. It's maybe not too surprising given that basically all Grey Knight units have good points per dollar compared with most of Warhammer 40k out there, and having a list that makes good use of combat patrols I guess makes that even better, even if the Grey Knight combat patrol discount isn't huge. I would say that Grey Knights maybe feel like a little bit of a danger army to be getting into in a big way at the moment though. It feels like at some point they're going to have a full range refresh similar to the Black Templars and what they got. I feel like there's a fairly good chance of that happening in either 10th or 11th edition, though obviously you can never be 100% sure with Games Workshop. For their counterparts in gold, the Adeptus Custodes can get some similar or better numbers with their combat patrol, and they've got much more modern sculpts that are highly unlikely to be updated anytime soon. I feel like that's one of the factors that pushes people towards the Golden Boys a bit more. Obviously this is just a small cross-section of Warhammer 40k armies, but of the ones that I looked at for this video, the Admech topped the list by a long way with $1,500, then we had Space Marines, Orks, Chaos and Necrons, all on a similar sort of price tag for this given competitive army. Imperial Knights a bit lower, and then Grey Knights significantly lower still. Certainly puts things into perspective a bit, the difference between the most costly and the least costly army here. You could literally be paying around about 3 times the cost for a Warhammer army if you went with the highest on the list versus the lowest. Obviously those are just the top line numbers, there's a few more costs, there's a bunch more costs that can go into a Warhammer 40k army, but also as mentioned all sorts of ways in which you can save money versus that top line figure. For getting these armies on the table, you need to take into account paints, glue, basing materials and magnets, never mind all the time and effort spent putting it together, though obviously that bit is part of the whole foreign hobby experience. There's then the price of the rules, which usually amounts to a codex book once per edition, maybe some data cards if you want some easy reference, and perhaps some things like the mission deck cards like Pariah Nexus, although I guess you could use those for multiple different armies. Plenty of third-party sites and apps and things do host all those things for free, much to the annoyance of Games Workshop of course. Then there's basic hobby supplies, dice, tape measures, objective markers, and what to transport the army with, and the price of wherever you might be playing, either putting together a gaming table for your own home, unless you're jury-rigging a bit of scenery, or any money that you might spend playing at a local shop or club or something. I feel like a few of these do feel a bit peripheral really, it's more paying for the sort of entertainment or the venue for some of them, or things that could apply to a whole bunch of armies, but certainly I feel like hobby supplies for actually getting them painted, and the cost of a codex book both could be accounted into the cost. On the flip side though, realistically there's all sorts of options in which you could reduce that top line figure from Games Workshop. Perhaps the first and most obvious one for people actually collecting real armies is to choose better value options out of each codex, rather than just blindly copying a top tier list. People often tend to make good use of the discount boxes for their armies, things like combat patrols, any battle forces or starter sets that might be going, or just focusing on the units that get you actually quite a lot of big exciting stuff on the table for less money. As mentioned, maybe things like Space Marine Hellblaster squads, for your Adeptus Astartes, where you get quite a lot of elite infantry versus say a 3-man Blade Guard squad. There's then the discount retailers as mentioned, maybe somewhere between 10 and 21% off, depending on where you are around the world. Buying things second hand off eBay can save a lot as well, ideally more than you'd be getting for the kits new from a discount retailer. Quality could be variable there. Plenty of people convert stuff and do stand-ins, maybe particularly for characters where they don't look all that dissimilar from standard troops. You could easily kit bash things like Space Marine Lieutenants, for example. 3D printing and proxies could be a handy tool for anything that is a bit excessively costed. Forge World miniatures and things tend to be a good target for that. Basically finding someone who's made something that's kind of similar to what you want, but legally distinct as a different sculpt, and going for that if it winds up being half the cost of a Games Workshop Forge World kit. Though it's not a route that everyone wants to go for. Between the lot of those, it does mean that you could have these top line numbers could come down by quite a bit. Just doing some very rough and ready maths to put together a few of those value savings. Here's just some thoughts with what you could do if you made some compromises to try and bring that AdMech army's cost down. For the combat patrols, we basically didn't use the tech priests in them to make way for the Skitarii marshals. Maybe you could sub one of those out, even if it might be a bit suboptimal for the actual army list setup. Just play with a tech priest manipulus instead. If you wanted to skimp out on the cost of the Skitarii marshals, which are basically kind of just upgraded Skitarii, I feel like they wouldn't be too hard to make some good stand-ins for out of some regular Skitarii miniatures and some fancy bits left over from the other kits. They might not be quite as cool as the standard model, but if you put a bunch of conversion work into it and use bits from other interesting kits, they might look even cooler. Assuming you're looking out for discount deals, maybe you manage to find at least one of these kits going at a good rate on eBay. Say for example, if you manage to land Call for 40% off rather than a 20% off from a discount retailer, that could be a win. If you wanted to try and save on the Iron Striders, maybe you could say that they're the one model that you're going to go for a 3D printed sort of route. Find a whole bunch of generic sci-fi 3D printed robot walkers that would look good with AdMech, and either buy them off a printing commission site or off Etsy or something, or get some files and either print yourself or have someone who you know with a 3D printer run them up for you. If you were able to save around about 50% versus Games Workshop $60 or so per walker, that could be a pretty massive $180 or so. Then presuming all the rest you just buy completely new, you could use a 15% discount retailer to save a bit of the rest on the other plastic, around about another $140 or so off the top line cost. Obviously all of these are a bit rough ready and a bit theoretical really, but overall feels like it's not unreasonable that you could save a good third or so on the majority of Warhammer armies out there. It will depend a bit on the exact amount of compromises, kit bashes, and luck on the second-hand market that you might be able to get though. With those numbers put in, it comes down to around about $1,070 from the $1,502. Still very expensive, but far less than the top line figure. Finally, just to end with one thing that I've kind of found interesting as a bit of a dangerous justification for picking up 40k armies. Generally, Warhammer miniatures do tend to hold their value really quite well, presuming that you actually look after your collection and are good enough on the hobbying side of things that your paint job or whatever won't detract from the value of them to other people massively. In general, you can still expect to recoup really quite a lot of money when you resell the army on later. If you ever did decide to either change factions, leave the hobby in general, or desperately needed to scrape around for money to pay something else outstanding, either another hobby or some important bills or something down the line. It's going to greatly vary on how much effort you put into them, what the state of the army is, and how in demand it is for how well it might sell. Just as a very rough ballpark estimate though, I think you could usually expect to get around about 50% of what you bought it for back. Sometimes you might be able to get more than that, sometimes it might be less though, particularly say if Games Workshop updates the miniatures in the meantime. Say for example, with people who've got the old style Tyranid Termagants and Gene Stealers, I feel like they wouldn't be quite as much in demand as the newer ones that Games Workshop came out with in 10th edition. Certainly for newer, more recent shiny sculpts though, seems unlikely that that would be too much of a factor. In any case though, let me know your thoughts on the cost of Warhammer 40k armies. What's your experience with collecting your own faction? Look forward to hearing your thoughts on these pricing estimates down in the comments. Price of entry is always one of the bigger, thornier issues for the hobby. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep them coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.